was no desire to get killed and eaten that made me go amongst tribes with the worst reputation in the world. I went amongst them because they were my best material. My father had died, and then my mother 6 weeks later. And from being busy all day long, I suddenly found myself at the age of 30 with time on my hands. So I cast around for something to occupy myself. And I came across a book my father had left unfinished on native religion and law. I'd been helping him, and I thought I might be able to finish it. That seemed to give me a very respectable excuse to go and skylark around in West Africa. The white man's grave, as they told me, the deadliest spot on earth. Well, the journey out was comfortable enough, except for the cockroaches which would nestle in the bunk with me, none of the modest reticence of the European variety. It was my fellow passengers who were uncomfortable. Their conversation was not at all calculated to soothe the fears of a nervous newcomer. It would go something like this. One of the agents would turn to the captain during a mealtime and say, "Do you remember Jay, Captain?" Knew him well, the captain would answer. Brought him out his last trip, poor chap. Then would follow full details of the pegging out of Jay, his funeral, and so on. Then a government official would turn to a colleague out for the first time and say in a friendly sort of way, "Brought any dress clothes with you?" The newcomer, scenting an allusion to a more cheerful phase of coast life, would gladly answer in the affirmative. "That's right," says the official. "You'll need 'em. Funerals." "Do you know," he would say, turning to another old coaster, "my dress trousers never got mouldy once last wet season." "Get along," says his friend. "You can't hang anything up for 24 hours without it being fit to graze a cow on." Never did hang 'em up for 24 hours, is the answer. Funerals. "Do you get anything else besides fever down there?" the newcomer would ask nervously. "Haven't much time as a rule," says the official, "but I have known chaps get craw-craw. Oh, and Portuguese itch intones the chorus, and yaws, and sleeping sickness, guinea worm, black water fever." A gentleman then observes that there are parasites, as far as he knows, everywhere on the coast, and some of them several yards long. "Do you remember poor Seaton?" he says, turning to the captain, who gives his usual answer. "Knew him well, poor chap, brought him out his last trip." "Eaten away," says this gentleman. "Eaten away inside and out. Parasites. And a quieter, better living man than Seaton never lived." "Never," says the chorus, sweeping away the hope that by being careful you might avoid such things. No, I try to make the conversation take a literary turn. "Have you read," I say, "that lively and amusing book, Twisted Lilac, by D.H. Soames?" "It's funny you should say that," says one of the agents. "Young D was found with that very book beside him. Dead as mutton, poor chap." With whatever subject you bring up, it is the same, and it is far better for the young coaster merely to collect the anecdotes and then lie low for a new coaster of your own to tell them to. And when your time comes to peg out and be poor so-and-so yourself, as come it will if you haunt the West Coast long enough, for goodness sake die somewhere where they haven't got a cemetery on a hill, for going uphill in stiff collars will cause your mourners to peg out too. Or better still, I was told, get an introduction to some Wesleyans. They're the only people on the coast with a hearse with feathers. I thought of turning back, but if I didn't, it wasn't because of any mistaken idea that I was brave. Oh, far from it. In fact, if I may speak the entire truth, I'm never quite happy on top of a bus. As to wild animals, well, I can confidently say that I am not in the least afraid of them until I actually see them. Then I yield to no one in terror. I vividly remember one occasion when I found myself alone on a tiny island with a hippopotamus. Now, I was most anxious that one of us should leave, but he was standing right by my canoe. In the end, I approached him, very timorously, and scratched him behind the ear with my umbrella. We parted on the best of terms, but one cannot be sure that wild animals will always be so accommodating, and I much preferred not to trust them at all. As to the cannibals of those parts, well, I went down to West Africa to die. West Africa amused me and was kind to me, and was scientifically interesting and didn't want to kill me just then. I was in no hurry. Oh, yes, there was danger, I suppose, and I certainly did see a good deal of my friends, the fan cannibals, who are bad repute. I will say this for them. I never found them treacherous, but then I never trusted them. And on this basis of mutual caution, a certain sort of friendship grew up between us. We each realized that we came from that section of the human race with whom it is better to drink than fight. We knew we should have killed each other if sufficient inducement had been offered, so we took a certain amount of care that the inducement shouldn't arise. And we did have a great deal in common, though not as much as some people seem to imagine. Some people will have it that I always travel with a well-hung leg of man in my portmanteau, or that I went down to West Africa to report on man as an article of diet. It was certainly highly recommended by my friends the fan cannibals. It was one of the reasons why I never liked to have an overwhelming percentage of them in my party when I travelled. They have an unpleasant habit of killing their travelling companions, cutting them up into neat pieces, eating what they want at the time, then smoking the rest for future use. Now, I had no desire to arrive at my destination in a smoked condition, even should my fragments be neat. But on reflection, it was their conversation rather than their views on diet that embarrassed me. "Where be your husband, Ma?" was one of the first questions always addressed to me. "I no got one," I would say. "No got," they would say, paralyzed with astonishment. "No got one, Ma." "No," I would say furiously. "Do you get much rubber around here?" But they never fell into any of my traps for trying to change the conversation. "Why you no got one," they would say. And the remainder of the conversation is unreportable. And in fact, I must warn any spinster who plans to go to the African jungle alone that she will be perpetually embarrassed by questions of "Where is your husband?" Not "Have you one?" or anything like that that you could deal with, but "Where is he?" Do not, on any account, say that you haven't got one. Say that you are searching for him, and then locate him in the direction in which you wish to travel. This elicits help and sympathy. As travelling companions, I found the fan cannibals friendly and brave and devoted to sport. Well, not that I joined them in this last amusement. I never feel it's quite ladylike to go around shooting things with a gun. They were also extremely fast. Oh, far too fast for me. But fortunately, every 2 hours, they stopped and had a snack of a pound or two of meat apiece. So I was able to catch up and then forge on ahead in order to get a bit of a start. While I was doing this one day, I was tempted to leave the path and take a shortcut. And the next news is that I was lying on a lot of spikes some 15 feet below ground level at the bottom of a bag-shaped game pit. Oh, it is at these times that you realize the blessings of a good, thick skirt. Now, had I paid heed to the advice of people who had urged me to adopt masculine garments instead of dressing exactly as usual, I should have been spiked to the bone and done for. Whereas, save for a good many bruises, here I was, with the fullness of my skirt tucked under me, sitting on 9 sharp ebony spikes, some 12 inches long, in comparative comfort, and howling lustily to be hauled out. One of my companions, I called Pagan, came along first. He looked down at me. "Oh, get a bush rope and haul me out," I said. He grunted and went and sat down on a log. The next one who came along looked down at me with great interest. "Do you kill?" says he. "Not much," say I. "Get a bush rope and haul me out." "No fit," says he, and goes and sits down on the log. Finally, however, 2 more of them came along, and one of them went and selected the one and only bush rope suitable to haul an English lady of my exact complexion, age, and size out of that particular pit. Well, they seemed rare from the time he took, but when it arrived, I was out in a twinkling and very much ashamed of myself, but pleased by my foresight in the matter of clothing, which is much as I am wearing now, except that I was wearing a jacket, of course. In the various villages where we passed the night, the fans Gay, devil-may-care characters as they certainly were, posed problems. For their pasts had a habit of catching up with them in a most unpleasant way. And the lodgings, so carefully provided for me by the village chiefs, sometimes left something to be desired. Or rather, they provided unusual features. In one village, the chief had his own hut cleaned out for me. It consisted of 2 apartments, almost bare, save for a few boxes, some little bags hanging from the roof poles, and a general supply of insects. He was a villainous-looking savage, but he behaved most hospitably and kindly. His first question, of course, was, what was I doing there? And I said very firmly I was a trader. You see, when you're away from the coast towns, in a thoroughly wild part of Africa, it's unwise to irritate the natives more than you can avoid. The climate's unhealthy enough, without your making matters worse by spoiling people's tempers with rude questions about their religion and private affairs, particularly if you happen to be, as I was, alone with them. But there's something reasonable about trade to all men. You see, when you first go amongst people who've never seen anything like you before, they naturally regard you as a devil. But when they see that you want to buy and sell with them, they realize that there's something human and reasonable about you after all. So, I did some brisk trading with my new friend, the chief, and at last I retired inside the hut, curled up amongst the boxes with my head on a tobacco sack, and the town grew quiet. I dozed, but on waking, realized the smell in the hut was now violent, from being shut up, I suppose, and it had an unmistakably organic origin. I knocked the ash end off the smouldering bushlight and investigated. I tracked the smell to the bags I'd seen hanging from the roof poles, so I took down the biggest one. I carefully noted exactly how the tie-tie had been put round its mouth, for these things are important and often mean a lot, and shook the contents out into my hat for fear of losing anything of value. They were a human hand, 3 big toes, 4 eyes, 2 ears, and other portions of the human frame. The hand was fresh, the others only so-so and shriveled. I replaced them, tied up the bag, and hung it up again. I was told later that although the fans will eat their fellow tribesfolk, they like to keep a little something belonging to them as a memento, a touching trait in their character and much to their credit. Still, it's unpleasant when they hang the remains in your bedroom, particularly when the bereavement in your host's family happens to be recent. I had a touching farewell with the fans, though we were sorry to lose each other's company. And so in peace, good feeling, and prosperity, I finally parted with those terrible cannibals, as everybody called them, and I turned for home. At least I should have turned for home if I hadn't met up with 3 choice spirits, ivory traders from the Ajumba tribe, and persuaded them to let me go with them on one of their trips after ivory. They were to take me and my small belongings in their canoe to a village, while they went further upriver on their own business. They were to call for me again on their way down. I was horribly nervous when we arrived, because on our way to the village, we'd come across a gentleman who danced and howled to us from the bank and obviously wanted to sell us something. We went for him like an arrow, thinking it might be a tooth. An elephant's, I mean, not his own. It wasn't a tooth, it was a leg, and not his own either. It belonged to quite some other gentleman. This upset my travelling companions and made them sick. The next morning, the fans turned their attention to me and started to sell me their stock of elephant tusks and India rubber. Now, I didn't want any of these things, but I felt far too nervous to point this out firmly, so I had to buy. I made it as long an affair as possible, but even so, I gradually found myself the proud owner of rubber and a tooth or so, and alas, my little stock of cloth and tobacco going all too fast. Now, to be short of money anywhere is bad, but to be short of money in a fan village is extremely bad, because these fans, when a trader has no more to sell them, are liable to start trading all over again by killing the trader, taking back their ivory and rubber, and waiting till another trader comes along. So I kept my eye upriver most anxiously for my black trader friend's canoe, and for days, in vain. All my trade stuff was by now exhausted, and I had to start selling my own belongings. And for the first time in my life, I felt the want of a big outfit. For my own clothes, I certainly did ask more for, pointing out that they were rare and curious. A dozen white ladies' blouses sold well. I can't say they looked well when worn by a brawny warrior in conjunction with nothing but red paint and a bunch of leopard tails. And I quite realize that a pair of stockings can be made to go further than we make them by using one at a time and placing the top end over your head and letting the rest of the garment float in the breeze. But I had all too few, and they were all gone before the canoe came. In fact, everything but what I stood up in had gone. The last thing I parted with was my toothbrush. And on the day that went, down came the canoe. And this time I really did turn for home. My brother was returning to England, and I was to go home and look after him domestically for as long as he wanted me to do so. I had to do it. It was a duty, and duty was the religion I was brought up in, and by which I've lived. Not that my life has amounted to much. It's been a comic sort of life, really, I suppose, and quite without romance, in the proper sense of the word. I make the confession humbly, rather as I would make the confession that I was deaf or blind. I have never known what it is to love. I've read about it. I can see by the actions of men and women that the thing exists, but I have never been in love, and nor has anyone ever been in love with me. Oh, it's an imperfection, I don't doubt it. But it's the non-human world I really belong to. My people are mangroves, swamps, rivers, and the sea. We understand each other. I suppose that's why the charm of West Africa seized me so strongly. A charm that, once you fall under its sway, you never escape from. It gives you pleasure to fall under it while you're out there. But when you're back in England, it gives you pain by calling you. And you hear, nearer to you than the voices of the people around you, nearer than the roar of the city traffic, the sound of wind talking in the hard palm leaves, the thump of tom-toms, the cry of parrots passing over the mangrove swamps in the evening time. And everything around you grows poor and thin in the face of that vision. And you want to go back to the coast that is calling you, saying, "Come back. This is where you belong."